The summer night hung thick over Willow Springs, Dakota territory, carrying the mingled scents of wood smoke, horse sweat, and something darker, the metallic tang of violence that seemed to seep from the very earth. Matilda Byrne pressed her spine against the whitewashed railing of the Henderson porch, her blue dress clinging to her skin in the humid air, watching the Lakota warrior named Wakiza adjust the eagle feathers in his war bonnet with careful, deliberate movements. Around them, townspeople clustered in uneasy groups, their voices creating a low murmur that made Matilda's nerves feel stretched like piano wire. She could see it in their faces, the kind of tension that preceded either celebration or catastrophe. And tonight felt decidedly like the latter. Earlier that week, she had overheard two merchants whispering near Hensley's general store about them Eastern investors who had come through 3 summers back, all pressed suits and gold watch chains, eager to inspect their mining claims. Haven't seen hide nor hair of 'em since old Murphy had muttered spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Probably couldn't stomach frontier life. But something in his tone had made Matilda's skin crawl a careful neutrality that suggested darker knowledge. You hear those hoofbeats? Wakiza's voice carried the weight of a man who had learned to read danger in the wind. His dark eyes, marked by lines earned through years of squinting across vast plains, swept methodically across the gathered crowd. Matilda nodded, her chest rising and falling with increasingly rapid breaths. Through the cottonwood trees bordering the property, she could make out the approaching thunder of multiple horses. The sound grew louder, 3 riders, perhaps 4, coming hard from town with the kind of urgency that meant serious business. "Greasy Pete," she whispered, recognizing the lead rider's distinctive slouch, even in silhouette. "With Buckskin Johnson and Toothless Sam Murphy, all Blackthorn's men." The crowd began to part like wheat before a scythe as the 3 mine guards pushed through, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden steps. Pete's greasy hair caught the lantern light, revealing a face that looked carved from granite by someone with a grudge against humanity. Behind him, Buckskin fingered his Colt's pearl handle, while Toothless Sam worked his tobacco with mechanical rhythm. Well. Pete drawled his voice, carrying oily satisfaction that made decent folks want to wash their hands after hearing it. "Look what we got here. A wanted man standing bold as brass where any Christian soul can see him." Wakiza's hand moved toward the bone-handled knife at his belt, but his movement was careful, measured. The warrior had learned long ago that survival often meant choosing the right moment to act. "What business you got with me, Pete?" "Sheriff's business, Chief." Pete pulled a folded paper from his stained vest, shaking it open with theatrical flourish. "Got a warrant here, all legal and proper, says you assaulted a mine guard in the commission of his lawful duties." "That'd be me, in case you're wondering." The crowd stirred uneasily. Matilda felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She had been there in the alley behind Hensley's boarding house earlier that day. She had seen Pete corner her with his sweaty hands and whispered threats, watched him try to force himself on her with that fake company favorite shit. She had seen Wakiza appear like an avenging angel to save her from something far worse than assault. "That's a damned lie," she said, stepping forward despite the voice in her head, her father's voice warning her that sometimes the bravest thing was to stay silent and live to fight another day. But Thomas Byrne had also taught her that some lies were too dangerous to let stand. Pete's eyes fixed on her like a snake spotting prey. "Well now, Miss Matilda Byrne, didn't see you there in that pretty blue dress. You got something to say about this legal matter?" Matilda felt every eye in the crowd turn toward her. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, and she found herself remembering something her father had once told her while teaching her to handle his surveyor's transit. "The most important measurement isn't the one you can see, Maddie. It's the one you can feel in your bones." Wakiza stood close enough that she could smell the wood smoke in his buckskin shirt, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. But even in this moment of mortal danger, she noticed his gaze wavering, dropping to the rise and fall of her chest, to the way her dress pulled tight in the lantern light. The realization hit her like a slap, that even now surrounded by enemies, he was still seeing her as a woman first, a person second. "My face is up here, warrior," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Whatever thoughts you have about what you're looking at, keep them to yourself. I need you thinking with your head, not your enough." Pete's roar cut her off, but something had shifted in the crowd's energy. Several townspeople were nodding approvingly at her words, and Wakiza himself had straightened his attention, snapping into sharp focus. "You got spirit, I'll give you that." Pete continued, but his grin had faltered slightly. "Too bad spirit don't count for much when the law comes calling." Buckskin shifted nervously in his saddle. "Pete, maybe you should shut your mouth and do what you're paid for," Pete snarled. Then he lunged. His meaty fist swung toward Wakiza's jaw, but the warrior was already moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to fight for his life before he learned to walk. He caught Pete's wrist twisted with practiced leverage that spoke of countless battles and sent the bigger man sprawling onto the grass with a bone-jarring thud that knocked the wind from his lungs. Buckskin's hand flew to his gun, but Matilda was faster. She grabbed the nearest lantern, heavy brass filled with coal oil, and hurled it between them, sending glass and burning fuel across the wooden planks. The flames caught immediately, casting wild shadows that turned the porch into a scene from Dante's imagination. "By thunder after them!" Sam shouted as flames licked at the porch posts and began spreading toward the house's wooden siding. Wakiza grabbed Matilda's hand, his grip firm but not painful. "Run!" They sprinted toward the cottonwood grove as pistol shots cracked behind them like winter ice breaking on the Missouri. A bullet splintered bark inches from Matilda's head, showering her with fragments. Another burned through her sleeve, the heat searing fabric and the skin beneath. She felt Wakiza stumble as a third shot opened a gash along his forearm, dark blood immediately soaking his buckskin shirt. "This way," he gasped, pulling her deeper into shadow, where moonlight couldn't penetrate the canopy. Behind them, guards crashed through underbrush, cursing and shouting. Pete's voice rose above the others, thick with pain and fury. "Find them. Blackthorn wants that redskin swinging before dawn." Matilda's lungs burned as they ran her corset, making each breath a struggle against bone and steel. Whatever deadly game they had stumbled into, one thing was crystal clear: they were both marked for death, and the night was only beginning. Chapter 1. The territory, Dakota Territory in 1879, was a land caught between worlds where civilization's thin veneer barely concealed the brutal realities of frontier life. Willow Springs sat in a valley between Owl Canyon's red stone walls and rolling hills that stretched toward the Badlands, a town of 300 souls trying to carve order from wilderness that had its own ideas about human ambition. Willow Creek wound through the settlement's heart like a silver thread, providing the precious water that meant the difference between life and death. The creek rose in the Owl Canyon foothills, fed by mountain springs that ran clear and cold even in the driest summers. But 5 miles upstream at Rattler's End Mine, Victor Blackthorn had built his fortune on other people's misery. The 50-year-old mine owner carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never faced a challenge he couldn't buy, intimidate, or destroy. His dam across Willow Creek diverted most of the water for washing ore, leaving barely a trickle for downstream Lakota camps and small farms. The official justification was industrial necessity. The reality was systematic starvation disguised as progress. Sheriff Claude Merrick called it legal and proper. The $200 Blackthorn slipped him monthly helped reinforce that opinion, along with additional payments for special services when circumstances required flexibility in law enforcement. Merrick wore his badge like a shield, hiding behind legal authority while serving only the highest bidder. In the office above Hensley's General Store, Matilda Byrne worked as a seamstress, stitching uniforms for mine guards and mending clothes for townspeople who could afford her services. At 19, she possessed the kind of practical beauty that came from honest work and clear conscience. Her auburn hair was always pulled back simply, and her green eyes held an intelligence that made some men uncomfortable, particularly those who preferred their women ornamental rather than useful. The room where she worked overlooked Main Street, giving her a clear view of the daily commerce that kept Willow Springs functioning. She had learned to read the town's moods in the faces that passed below tight with worry when mine payroll was late, flushed with false prosperity when Blackthorn's men came to town with pockets full of company scrip. Beatrice Colton ran the one-room schoolhouse with the fierce dedication of someone who viewed ignorance as humanity's greatest enemy. At 35, she had never married, but adopted the town's children as her own, regardless of whether their parents could pay for education. Her schoolhouse served as classroom meeting hall and informal courthouse, one of the few places where Lakota and white children learned together, much to the discomfort of some parents. She provided Matilda room and board in exchange for help with younger students, an arrangement that suited them both. Beatrice needed assistance with children who spoke more Lakota than English, while Matilda required safe housing and honest work that didn't depend on Blackthorn's favor. The arrangement also gave Matilda cover for activities that would have been impossible otherwise. Late at night, she would slip through back alleys carrying bundles of food scraps to hungry Lakota children whose families had been cut off from the creek. It was dangerous work. Blackthorn's men didn't appreciate charity toward hostiles. But Matilda couldn't watch children starve while company officials counted profits. Her father, Thomas Byrne, had been a surveyor who vanished in autumn 1878 while mapping land claims in the hills above Willow Springs. Before his disappearance, he had taught his daughter frontier survival skills that most young ladies never learned: reading terrain like a book, tying knots that would hold under pressure, handling herself when cornered by men who mistook kindness for weakness. Thomas had also taught her to observe and remember everything, because details that seemed insignificant might one day mean the difference between life and death. "The land doesn't lie, Maddie," he would say, while showing her how to use his surveyor's instruments. "People lie, governments lie, but the land tells the truth to anyone who knows how to listen." Dr. Edwin Hale treated anyone needing healing regardless of ability to pay or color of skin. The 40-year-old physician had studied back east, but chose frontier practice, believing medicine should serve those who needed it most rather than those who could afford it best. His resources were limited, supplies often low, but dedication never wavered. Lately, he had been treating unusual numbers of rashes among ranch hands working near the creek, along with stomach ailments in Lakota children who drank from downstream pools. His growing suspicion that mine runoff was poisoning the water kept him awake nights staring at ceiling beams while wondering what kind of evidence would convince territorial authorities to investigate. The problem was that Victor Blackthorn's influence extended far beyond Willow Springs. Territorial officials who owed their positions to favorable recommendations found it easy to overlook complaints about a productive mine operation, especially when those complaints came from Indians and poor farmers who couldn't contribute to political campaigns. 30-year-old Wakiza moved through the world with the careful grace of a man who had learned to survive in two cultures without fully belonging to either. A hip wound from Little Bighorn in 1876 left him with a permanent limp, but hadn't slowed his mind or dulled his instincts for reading danger in human faces. He hunted the hills above Willow Springs, bringing venison to Winona, a 50-year-old Lakota healer who shared medicinal plant knowledge with Dr. Hale and occasionally with Beatrice when children fell ill. The arrangement was unofficial and carefully hidden from authorities who would have considered it evidence of conspiracy. Wakiza had been present at Custer's defeat, had seen what happened when arrogance met reality on the Montana plains. The experience left him with a deep understanding that violence often created more problems than it solved, but also that some people would only respond to overwhelming force. Tension between Lakota camps and white settlement had been building all summer as drought caused by blackthorn's dam killed crops and forced families to travel farther daily for clean water. Young warriors spoke of direct action, while elders counseled patience they were rapidly losing. Everyone could feel storm clouds gathering on the political horizon. It was in this powder keg atmosphere that a summer storm brought the first hint of alliances to come. Lightning struck a massive pine during flash flooding, sending the tree crashing across Willow Creek and trapping 8-year-old Jimmy Colton, Beatrice's nephew, in the rushing torrent. Matilda and Beatrice waded into the muddy water, while Wakaza appeared with a hatchet chopping methodically at the massive trunk, despite the current's attempts to sweep him downstream. Dr. Hale arrived as they pulled Jimmy to shore, his left wrist clearly broken and his face blue with cold. The physician worked quickly, splinting the fracture while the boy cried for his mother. It was a moment of cooperation that showed what was possible when people worked together instead of being kept apart by artificial divisions. For a brief time, it seemed like the valley's problems might be solved through goodwill and common sense. Then quiet will appeared. Blackthorn's foreman was a tall, lean man of 40 with pale eyes and a soft voice somehow more menacing than any shout. He pushed Dr. Hale aside without ceremony and ordered his men to close the dam gates even tighter. "Mine needs every drop," he said quietly, his words carrying the authority of someone who had never been successfully challenged. "Boss's orders." "That boy could have drowned," Hale protested, still holding his medical supplies. "And there's barely enough flow now for basic—" "For what?" Will's hand rested casually on his gun grip, fingers drumming a slow rhythm against leather. "For a bunch of savages who don't understand property rights. For squatter farmers who never filed proper claims." Wakiza straightened slowly, water dripping from his buckskin leggings. Despite his injured hip, he moved with predatory grace that made several of Will's men shift nervously. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, across distance, measured in more than feet, across cultures, across histories of violence and betrayal that stretched back generations. Then Will smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes, and walked away, his men following like wolves behind their pack leader. The incident left everyone shaken in different ways. Beatrice held her nephew close, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed about how everything would be all right. Matilda watched Wakiza favor his injured hip as he walked toward the Lakota camp's jaw, tight with suppressed anger. Dr. Hale gathered his supplies with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from rage at his own powerlessness. That evening, as Matilda mended a torn seam by lamplight in her room above the schoolhouse, she wondered how much longer the fragile peace could hold. Outside her window, Willow Creek murmured its way toward the valley, carrying hopes and fears of everyone who depended on its flow. She had no way of knowing that within days, the careful balance her father had tried to preserve would collapse entirely, dragging her into a conflict that would test everything he had taught her about survival justice and the price of standing up to power. In his office above the Miners' Rest Saloon, Victor Blackthorn stood before a faded photograph, mounted in an expensive frame, himself and Thomas Byrne, shaking hands beside their first successful claim, both men young and full of ambition. For just a moment, his pale eyes held something that might have been regret before the expression hardened back into calculated coldness. Some partnerships, he reflected, were doomed from the moment idealism met reality. Chapter 2. The Cornering. The trouble started on Tuesday morning when Greasy Pete cornered Matilda behind Hensley's boarding house. She had been delivering a mended shirt to Mrs. Henderson when Pete stepped from the shadows between buildings, blocking her path to the main street with deliberate intent. "Well, well, Miss Byrne." His voice held oily satisfaction that made her skin crawl. Perfect timing. Pete stood nearly 6 feet, but carried himself like a smaller man, trying to appear larger, shoulders thrown back and chest puffed out in aggressive display. Unwashed hair hung in greasy strands around a face marked by old smallpox scars and newer knife wounds. The worst ran from his left ear to his mouth's corner, pulling his lips into a permanent sneer that made every expression look threatening. "Excuse me." Matilda tried stepping around him, but Pete moved to block her way with surprising quickness for such a bulky man. "Not so fast. Got something for you." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper, holding it up where she could see the company seal. "Favor chit. Payment in advance for services to be rendered." Matilda recognized it immediately as one of Blackthorn's infamous favor chits, IOU's mine guards used to extort sexual favors from desperate women throughout the territory. The practice was an open secret tolerated by Sheriff Merrick as long as monthly payments continued flowing into his personal accounts. "I don't know what kind of woman you think I am," she said, keeping her voice steady despite building fear. "But you're badly mistaken." Pete's grin widened, revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco juice. "Oh, I know exactly what kind you are. The kind who needs protection in a dangerous world. The kind whose daddy can't look after her anymore." The mention of her father hit like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories she had tried to suppress. Thomas Byrne reading to her by lamplight, teaching her to use his surveyor's equipment, promising he would be back from the hills before first snow. Pete watched her reaction with obvious satisfaction, then stepped closer until she could smell unwashed sweat and stale whiskey on his breath. See, word around town is Tom Byrne got himself lost, permanent-like, in them hills. Terrible shame losing a man like that. Pete's voice carried knowledge beyond mere gossip, intimate details that made her blood run cold. Of course, a man can get lost real permanent if he goes poking around where he don't belong. Matilda's heart began racing as implications sank in. "What do you know about my father?" "I know he had maps. Important maps showing water rights and mineral claims that certain people found real interesting." Pete reached out and stuffed the chit into her bodice fingers, lingering with deliberate violation. "I also know his daughter's got to make a living somehow, and pretty girls got limited options in territory like this." The paper felt like ice against her skin despite the summer heat. Around them, the alley seemed to press closer, trapping her between wooden walls and Pete's bulk. She grabbed his wrist, trying to pull his hand away, but Pete was stronger and had been expecting resistance. "A payment's already arranged with the boss," he whispered, breath hot against her ear. "He says you're worth every penny, especially with that fire in your eyes. Some men like their women with spirit." Matilda tore the paper in half and threw the pieces at his feet, her father's voice echoing in memory. "Never let them see you're afraid, Maddie. Fear makes them stronger." "Go to hell." Pete's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the Badlands. His free hand shot out and closed around her throat, pressing her against the rough boarding house wall with enough force to drive splinters through her dress. That wasn't smart, girl. Real stupid, in fact. His grip tightened, cutting off air and making black spots dance at her vision's edges. See, Mr. Blackthorn don't like being told no. Makes him feel unappreciated after all he's done for this community. Matilda clawed at his fingers, but Pete only squeezed harder, his face inches from hers. She was dimly aware of approaching footsteps, but Pete seemed oblivious to everything except his power over her, the way her struggles grew weaker as oxygen disappeared. "Of course, if you're real nice about apologizing," he continued conversationally, "maybe we can work something out. Maybe you just owe a little interest instead of the full payment. Let her go." The voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried authority that made Pete's head snap around like a startled animal. Wakiza stood at the alley's mouth, a burlap sack of cornmeal slung over one shoulder, and his dark eyes taking in the situation at a single glance. "This ain't your business, Chief." Pete snarled, but his grip on Matilda's throat loosened slightly as he calculated odds. "I am making it my business." Wakiza set down the cornmeal with careful deliberation and stepped forward, his movements fluid, despite the old hip wound. "Step away from the woman." Pete released Matilda and spun to face the warrior hand, dropping to his belt knife with practiced ease. "You threatening me, boy. You know what happens to Indians who threaten white men in this territory. I am giving you a chance to walk away with your pride intact." Wakiza's voice remained level, but something in his posture changed a predatory stillness that made the air itself seem dangerous. Pete's laugh was ugly, filled with the confidence of a man who had never lost a fight against someone he considered inferior. "You hear that savage thinks he's giving me orders." The knife appeared with practiced ease, blade catching morning sunlight. "Time somebody taught you your place in the natural order." He lunged with surprising speed, but Wakiza was already moving, sidestepping the thrust and grabbing Pete's wrist in one smooth motion. What followed was brief and vicious, Pete driving his head forward to catch Wakiza in the ribs, the warrior twisting to throw his opponent off balance, both men crashing into barrels and boxes stacked along the alley walls. Pete was heavier and fought dirty, using elbows and knees with vicious efficiency. But Wakiza had quickness born from lifetime training and the desperate strength of someone fighting for more than his own life. They grappled for control of the knife, rolling across dirt and debris, while Matilda pressed against the wall, throat burning as she tried to breathe. Through tears, she saw Pete break free and dive for his fallen weapon. Without thinking, she pulled the long hatpin from her hair, a weapon her father had taught her to carry for exactly this situation, and drove it deep into Pete's cheek as he bent down. Pete's scream brought running footsteps from the street. "Deputies!" someone shouted. "Fight in the alley." Wakiza grabbed Matilda's arm, his grip gentle but urgent. "We have to go. Now." They ran toward the alley's back, but two of Merrick's men appeared at the far end, guns drawn and faces grim. Wakiza pulled Matilda behind flour barrels, just as shooting started, bullets splintering wood inches from their heads and sending white powder cascading like snow. "This way." Wakiza whispered, toppling barrels to create a barrier between them and the deputies. They crawled through chaos to reach the livery stable, where Wakiza quickly saddled the fastest-looking horse, while Matilda kept watch. She climbed behind him as more deputies appeared on nearby rooftops, rifles glinting in morning sunlight. The horse bolted from the stable as bullets whined overhead, one grazing Wakiza's ribs and drawing blood across his buckskin shirt. But he kept riding, guiding them down Main Street and out of town, leaving behind dust and angry lawmen. As they rode toward the hills, Matilda pressed her face against Wakiza's back and tried processing what had happened. In minutes, her quiet life had exploded into violence and flight. But Pete's knife lay back in that alley, and she had gotten a good look at it before the fighting started. The brass star inlaid in the handle was identical to one she had seen among her father's belongings. A knife, he said, belonged to a man who could never be trusted. Now she was a fugitive riding double with a Lakota warrior, while Sheriff Merrick printed wanted posters offering $100 bounties for their capture. Behind them, Blackthorn's influence spread through the territorial legal system like poison, ensuring no witnesses would survive to contradict the official story. But Matilda had survived, and she was beginning to understand that her father's disappearance was no accident. Someone had killed Thomas Byrne for those survey maps, and that same someone now wanted her silenced before she could reveal what she knew. The question was whether she and Wakiza could stay alive long enough to expose the truth. Chapter 3. The Chase. The stolen mare's hooves drummed against hard-packed earth of the short grass flats as Wakiza guided them away from Willow Springs under a quarter moon's pale light. Behind them, the town's lanterns grew smaller until they disappeared, entirely swallowed by Dakota Territory's rolling darkness, like stones dropped into still water. Matilda clung to Wakiza's waist, feeling his steady breathing despite the pain from his bullet graze. The horse beneath them was strong, but not built for carrying double at the punishing pace they had maintained for an hour, and foam was beginning to appear around her bit. "She's tiring," Wakiza said over his shoulder voice, carefully neutral. "We need to rest soon, or she'll collapse under us." As if confirming his words, the mare stumbled slightly, catching herself, but losing momentum in the process. In the distance, a coyote yipped, answered by another from a different direction. Soon the night filled with their calls, a hunting pack shadowing their movements through the darkness. How much farther to safety? Matilda asked, though she was beginning to suspect there was no such thing as safety in Dakota territory. Not for people who had crossed Victor Blackthorn. Depends on what you call safe. Waukeeza guided the horse toward a bend in Willow Creek, where cottonwoods offered concealment from searching eyes. Right now, nowhere is safe for either of us. They dismounted near the water's edge, and the mare immediately lowered her head to drink, while Waukeeza pressed his hand to his side face, tight with pain. In moonlight, Matilda could see the dark stain spreading across his shirt, larger than it had appeared during their escape. "You're bleeding worse than you let on," she said, moving closer. "It will keep until we reach help." "No, it won't." She examined the wound by touch, since light was too dim for proper examination. The bullet had carved a furrow along his ribs, deep enough to need attention, but not immediately life-threatening. "We need to stop this bleeding, or you'll pass out before dawn." Waukeeza looked at her for a long moment, and she realized he was measuring something not her medical knowledge, which was limited, but her resolve. Whatever test she was taking, she seemed to pass it. "There is a healing woman not far from here. Winona. She will help us. Can we trust her with our lives?" His certainty was absolute. But first, he gestured toward the creek. "Wash the powder from your hair. We look like ghosts walking." They knelt by the water's edge, splashing away flour dust from their escape. As Matilda cupped cold creek water in her hands, she became aware of Waukeeza, watching her in the dim light. Not the way Pete had looked at her with hunger and ownership, but with something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Respect. The silence between them stretched comfortable and strange, until Matilda felt compelled to break it. "I'm staying this close to keep you from falling off that horse," she said without looking up from the water. "What happens between us, or to either of us, it's not about anything except survival." Waukeeza's low chuckle surprised her. "You speak plainly for a white woman. My father taught me not to waste words when action was needed." The mention of Thomas Byrne sent fresh pain through her chest. He said most people talk too much and listen too little. He sounds like a wise man. Matilda's hands stilled in the water. He was. Until someone killed him for being too wise about the wrong things. They finished washing and mounted again, riding more slowly toward the Lakota camps. Coyotes continued shadowing them, calls growing bolder as blood scent reached them on the night wind. Waukeeza's breathing had become labored, and Matilda could feel tension in his muscles as he fought to stay upright in the saddle. "Tell me about the healing woman," she said, partly to distract him from pain, and partly because silence had become oppressive. "Winona raised me after my parents died from white man's sickness," Waukeeza replied. "She taught me which plants heal and which plants kill. She also taught me that some white people were worth saving, though most of her experience suggested otherwise." "What changed her mind?" "Your father." The simple statement hung in the air between them. "When I tracked him through the hills watching to make sure he meant no harm to our people, I saw him share his food with hungry children. He learned their names. He asked permission before crossing sacred places." Matilda felt tears threatening and forced them back. Crying would accomplish nothing except making her eyes swell, and she suspected she would need clear vision before this night ended. Winona's shelter sat in a grove near the main camp, marked by sweet sage smoke and bundles of medicinal herbs hanging from wooden frames. The elderly healer emerged before they had dismounted, as if expecting them. "Waukeeza," she said in English for Matilda's benefit. "I heard the shooting in town. Bring him inside, girl, quickly." The shelter was larger than it appeared outside, with buffalo hide walls and a central fire pit casting dancing shadows on dried plants hanging from roof poles. Winona worked with swift efficiency, cutting away Wakiza's shirt and examining the wound by firelight. "Clean cut," she pronounced. The bullet passed through muscle, missed the ribs. "You will live, but you need rest and proper food." She began preparing a poultice from herbs and clean water. What foolishness brought this trouble to my door? As Winona stitched the wound closed with practiced skill, Wakiza explained what had happened in the alley behind Hensley's boarding house. The healer listened without comment, her weathered hands steady despite obvious anger building in her dark eyes. "Blackthorn's men came through the camp this afternoon," she said when he finished. "Looking for thieves," they said. "Turned over lodge after lodge, scared the children, threatened the elders. Found nothing because there was nothing to find." "They're tightening their grip," Matilda observed, "making sure no one can stand against them when the time comes." "Perhaps." Winona tied off the last stitch and began bandaging the wound with strips of clean cloth. But sometimes when a man squeezes too hard, things slip through his fingers like water. Footsteps outside announced another arrival. Dr. Hale ducked through the entrance, carrying his medical bag and a leather satchel that clinked softly when he set it down. "Thought I might find you here," he said to Matilda. "Half the town saw you riding out with Wakiza. The other half is already calling for a lynching party." "What's your interest in this, Doc?" Wakiza asked, wincing as Winona tightened his bandages. Hale set down his satchel carefully and opened it to reveal a dozen glass vials filled with water samples, each carefully labeled with location and date. "I've been collecting these from up and down Willow Creek for 3 months, testing them for mineral content, looking for the source of these stomach ailments and rashes I've been treating." He held up one vial containing water so murky it looked like liquid mud. "What I found isn't good. The mine runoff is poisoning everything downstream. Heavy metals, chemical compounds from ore processing. It's turning the creek into a slow-acting poison." "Can you prove it?" Matilda asked. "If I can get these samples to the Territorial Land Office in Crow's Landing, along with proper documentation, I can prove Blackthorn's Dam is violating federal water rights. But that's a 2-day ride through country Merrick will have watched by morning. Which is why you need help." Hale looked directly at her. "Your father was surveying those same water rights before he disappeared. If you know anything about his work, any maps or documents he might have left, it could make the difference between justice and massacre." Matilda felt the weight of their stares. Outside, wind rattled the shelter walls, carrying distant wolf howls and the promise of rain. She thought of her father's leather portfolio, hidden beneath loose floorboards, in her room at the schoolhouse, containing surveys and measurements that could expose Blackthorn's crimes. "I have them," she said quietly. "The original survey maps showing public easements along Willow Creek. My father hid them before he disappeared, but I found them after Sheriff Merrick stopped looking for him." "Why haven't you filed them with territorial authorities?" Dr. Hale asked. "Because I was afraid." The words came out harder than intended, carrying months of suppressed anger and guilt. "My father disappeared right after finishing that survey. I was 19 alone with no money and no way to travel safely to Crow's Landing. I thought if I kept quiet, maybe they'd leave me alone to grieve in peace. And now," Matilda looked around the circle at Winona's fierce old eyes, reflecting firelight at Wakiza, favoring his wounded side, but still alert for danger at Dr. Hale's hands stained with blood of patients he couldn't save from poisoned water. "Now I realize they were never going to leave me alone. Pete knew something about my father's death, he practically admitted it. And if we don't stop Blackthorn now, more people are going to die." A wolf howled close by, answered by others from different directions. The pack was closing in, drawn by blood scent and promise of easy prey. But there were other hunters in the darkness, more dangerous than wolves. Winona stood and moved to dried plants hanging near the fire. "Smudge grass," she explained, crumbling herbs into the flames. The smoke will drive away four-legged hunters, but it may also draw the two-legged kind. As thick, sweet-smelling smoke began filling the shelter, Matilda made her decision. I'll get the maps. But we do this together, and we do it right. No more running, no more hiding. It's time to finish what my father started. Outside, wolves circled closer, yellow eyes reflecting firelight that leaked through gaps in the shelter walls. But inside, four unlikely allies began planning the downfall of the most powerful man in Dakota territory, knowing that by morning either justice would prevail or they would all be dead. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and this time they would be the hunters. Chapter 4. The Evidence. Dawn came gray and cold over the Lakota camp, carrying the smell of rain and distant sound of horses moving through the hills. Dr. Hale had worked through the night, carefully copying pages from his water analysis notes, while Winona prepared traveling supplies and Matilda helped Wakiza test his wounded rib's mobility. Movement's good, Wakiza pronounced, though Matilda could see pain he was hiding behind stoic expression. I can ride and fight if necessary. The question is whether we can reach Crow's Landing before Merrick closes all the roads. Hale said, sealing his water samples in a padded case designed to protect fragile evidence. He's no fool. By now he'll have telegraphed every sheriff between here and the territorial capital. Beatrice Colton arrived with Sunrise leading a pack horse loaded with supplies and wearing the grim expression of someone who had seen too much violence in too short a time. The schoolteacher's usually neat appearance was disheveled, her dress torn at the sleeve and dirt under her fingernails. They searched the school, she announced without preamble, dismounting stiffly. Merrick and 3 deputies looking for evidence of conspiracy. Tore apart half my classroom before I convinced them you weren't hiding under the children's desks. Did they find the maps? Matilda asked, heart racing with possibility of disaster. They found what I wanted them to find. Beatrice's smile was grim but satisfied. A set of county survey maps perfectly legal and completely useless for proving anything about water rights. The real ones are safe. She produced an oilskin pouch from her saddlebags, handing it to Matilda with the careful reverence of someone handling sacred relics. Inside were her father's original maps, hand-copied in Beatrice's precise script onto waterproof paper. Insurance, Beatrice explained. If something happens to the originals, these copies will serve just as well in any court that cares about justice. Their planning was interrupted by approaching hoofbeats and shouting voices. Adam Pierce, a struggling farmer whose land bordered the creek, rode into camp at full gallop, his face flushed with exertion and something that looked like terror. Riders coming. He gasped, sliding from his horse on unsteady legs. 6 men, maybe 8, armed and moving fast from town direction. Winona was already packing her medicine bundles, moving with the efficient calm of someone who had fled armed pauses before. Time to go. The creek trail leads north to the old Trapper's Bridge. From there you can reach the main road without passing through town. But even as they prepared to leave, the sound of horses grew louder and more organized. Through the trees, Matilda could see riders spreading out to surround the camp in classic military formation. Buckskin and Toothless Sam were among them, along with 4 deputies she didn't recognize. They're cutting off the creek trail. Wakiza observed, his voice matter of fact despite their desperate situation. We need another way out. The river, Adam said suddenly. There's a skiff hidden in the rushes downstream. I use it for checking my irrigation ditches when the creek runs high. It's not much, but it'll carry 4 people if we're careful about weight distribution. They had no choice. Loading supplies into Beatrice's pack frame, they made their way through tall grass toward the creek's edge, staying low to avoid being spotted by riders who were now close enough to hear shouting orders back and forth. The skiff was exactly where Adam had said, a flat-bottomed boat, barely 12 feet long, hidden among cattails and rushes. It would be tight for 5 adults plus supplies, but it was their only chance of escaping the tightening noose. They pushed off just as first shots rang out from the camp behind them. Buckskin had spotted movement in the reeds and was firing from horseback bullets, kicking up geysers of muddy water around the heavily loaded skiff. "Keep low," Wakiza shouted, taking the steering oar, while Adam and Dr. Hale paddled furiously. The creek was running higher than usual, due to recent rains creating fast current that swept them downstream faster than horses could follow along the bank. But it also created new hazards, submerged logs, unexpected rapids, and shallow channels that threatened to ground them within rifle range of pursuers. A bullet shattered one of Dr. Hale's sample vials, sending glass and precious evidence across the boat's bottom. The physician quickly resealed the broken container with candle wax from his medical kit, saving what remained of the contaminated water inside. "Rapids ahead," Adam called out, pointing where the creek narrowed between rocky outcrops that created white water and dangerous cross-currents. The skiff spun sideways in the increasingly violent current, threatening to capsize and dump them all into water. That would probably kill them, even if Blackthorn's men didn't. Matilda threw herself to the low side, while Wakiza fought to bring the bow around his injured ribs, screaming protest with every twist of the steering oar. Water poured over the gunnels, soaking their supplies and making the boat harder to control with each passing second. For a terrifying moment, they were completely at the current's mercy, spinning helplessly toward rocks that would smash their fragile craft to splinters. Then Matilda spotted a fallen tree extending into the water from the far bank, its trunk thick enough to anchor against. "Rope," she shouted to Adam. "Throw me that rope." She caught the line on the second throw and managed to loop it around a sturdy branch. The skiff swung around the anchor point like a pendulum, bringing them into calmer water on the rapid's far side, but leaving them soaked and bailing frantically. They had lost one paddle and taken on enough water to make continued navigation dangerous, but they were alive and moving. More importantly, they had put enough distance between themselves and pursuers to reach the schoolhouse safely. But their troubles were far from over. "Smoke," Beatrice said quietly, pointing toward town with obvious dread. "Coming from the direction of the school." They beached the skiff and climbed the bank for a better view. In the distance, black smoke rose from what had been Beatrice's classroom flames, visible through windows that had been her pride and joy. "They're burning us out," Dr. Hale said grimly, "destroying any evidence we might have left behind." "The children," Beatrice whispered, and Matilda could see her imagining the worst possible scenarios. If anyone was inside when they started the fire, the school would be empty at this hour. Matilda assured her, though she felt sick at the sight of educational materials being destroyed. "But we need to get there before they destroy everything that matters." The run to the schoolhouse took them across open ground with little cover, making them vulnerable to anyone watching from town. They could see riders moving through Willow Springs streets, but whether they were Merrick's men or concerned citizens was impossible to tell from distance. They reached the school to find the building intact, but badly damaged by deliberate arson. Someone had thrown burning oil through windows, charring wooden floors and walls. Desks were overturned, books scattered like wounded birds. And the American flag behind Beatrice's desk was reduced to ashes. But in the chaos, the arsonists had been careless or overconfident. Beatrice's roll-top desk had been pushed against the back wall, its drawers dumped and contents scattered. But the secret compartment behind them, a hiding place known only to Beatrice and Matilda, remained untouched. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and carefully preserved, were Thomas Burns' original survey maps. "Insurance pays off," Beatrice said, tucking the maps inside her coat with hands that shook slightly. "Now we have both sets, original and copy." As they prepared to leave through the school's rear door, Adam appeared at the front entrance, his face grim with new information. "Trouble coming," he announced. "3 riders moving this way fast. Pete's with them, and he looks madder than a wet cat." Greasy Pete's voice reached them before they saw him carrying clearly through the damaged building. "Burned nice and clean, didn't it? Just like old Tom Burns' survey shack up in them hills? Amazing how fast dry wood catches fire when a man knows what he's doing." The words hit Matilda like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears. Pete was practically confessing to her father's murder, taunting her with knowledge of how Thomas Byrne had died alone in the wilderness. "We need to go," Wakiza said quietly, but with absolute certainty. "Now." But Pete had already seen them through the damaged windows, and his shout brought Buckskin and Toothless Sam at a gallop, guns drawn and ready for violence. What followed was a running battle through Willow Springs streets, as Matilda and her allies used every scrap of available cover water troughs, overturned wagons, storefronts, while Pete's men tried to pin them down with rifle fire that sent splinters flying and civilians diving for safety. The turning point came when Beatrice, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed, grabbed a fence rail and used it to sweep Toothless Sam from his horse, sending him tumbling into a mud puddle with a splash that drew laughter from watching townspeople. The unexpected attack gave them the opening they needed to reach the livery stable and horses that Adam had prepared for exactly this contingency. As they rode out of town for the second time in 2 days, Matilda clutched her father's survey maps against her chest and tried processing what Pete had revealed. Her father hadn't simply disappeared in the hills during a routine survey. He had been murdered in cold blood, and his killer was now trying to finish what he had started by silencing the only witness who could expose the truth about Thomas Byrne's death. But Pete had made one crucial mistake. In his moment of gloating triumph, he had revealed that her father's survey camp had been deliberately burned just like the schoolhouse. If the site could be found, there might still be evidence of what had really happened on that October day in 1878. The race to Crow's Landing had become something more than a fight for water rights and justice. It was now a race to prevent massacre and expose conspiracy that reached the highest levels of territorial government. And somewhere in the hills above Willow Springs, the burned remains of her father's final campsite held the key to bringing down the most powerful and dangerous man in Dakota territory. Chapter 5. Alliances. The barn where Adam Pierce stored his winter hay stood 3 miles north of Willow Springs, close enough for convenience, but far enough to avoid casual observation from town. It was here that their unlikely alliance gathered as the sun reached its zenith. Matilda Wakiza, Dr. Hale, Beatrice, and Adam himself, and their horses lathered with sweat and nerves stretched to breaking. Inside the barn, shafts of sunlight streamed through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. The smell of hay mixed with horse sweat, and the metallic scent of fear as they realized the magnitude of what they were attempting. "We can't keep running forever," Dr. Hale said, setting his water samples carefully in shade, where heat wouldn't affect their chemical composition. Merrick's got men watching every trail between here and Crow's Landing, and Blackthorn's influence reaches farther than any of us know. Adam nodded grimly, looking older than his 45 years. The farmer's work-hardened hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made everyone lean forward with sudden attention. "There's something I need to tell you all," he said heavily. "Something I should have said years ago, but I was too scared of what might happen to my family." He produced a torn piece of ledger paper, smoothing it on a hay bale with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence of enormous crimes. The page revealed columns of figures and names in careful clerk's handwriting that made Matilda's blood run cold. Sheriff Merrick, $200 monthly, she read aloud, her voice growing smaller with each entry. Judge Harrison, $500 per favorable ruling. County Clerk Phillips, $100 per document falsified. Her voice faltered at an entry near the bottom. Guardianship fee, M. Byrne, $300. The silence that followed was broken only by distant horses on the main road and the sound of wind through the barn's wooden walls. Wakiza shifted uncomfortably, favoring his injured ribs, while Beatrice's face had gone pale as winter snow. Guardianship fee. Hale asked, though his medical training had already led him to the correct conclusion. What exactly does that mean? It means, said a voice from the barn's entrance, that Miss Byrne is legally considered a ward of the territorial court, with Victor Blackthorne named as her guardian and legal custodian. They turned to see a woman in her 30s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that had seen too much corruption. Sarah Whitman, the county clerk's wife, stepped into the barn carrying a worn leather folder that seemed to contain the weight of the world. Mrs. Whitman, Beatrice breathed. What are you doing here? How did you find us? Trying to prevent a terrible injustice. Sarah replied, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had wrestled with conscience and finally chosen the harder path. When I heard about the search warrants and shooting, I checked the courthouse files. What I found? She shook her head. Someone's been very busy forging documents and filing false papers. From her folder, she produced several official-looking documents that bore territorial seals and legal language. A guardianship order filed 3 days after Thomas Byrne's disappearance, naming Victor Blackthorne as legal guardian for his orphaned daughter. A mining debt certificate showing Thomas owed Blackthorne $1,200 for equipment and supplies, and a work indenture binding Matilda to labor off that debt at whatever rate Mr. Blackthorne deems appropriate. But that's impossible. Matilda protested, her world tilting on its axis. My father never borrowed money from Blackthorne. He hated everything the man stood for. I know it's forged. Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying 15 years of accumulated guilt. I've been keeping records in my husband's office since we came to Dakota Territory. More than that, I remember when these papers were filed. I was working late that October night in 1878, just 3 days after word came that Thomas Byrne had gone missing in the hills. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. Victor Blackthorne came to the courthouse himself that night, accompanied by that man they call Greasy Pete, and 2 others I didn't recognize. They paid all the filing fees in gold coins and seemed very eager to have the paperwork processed immediately, despite the late hour. The implications hit Matilda like an avalanche. Under territorial law, an unmarried woman under 21 could be placed under guardianship if her parents died leaving debts. The guardian would have complete control over her movements, work, and earnings until the debt was paid, or she married with the guardian's consent. It's a trap, she whispered, understanding flooding over her. He killed my father to get the survey maps, then forged these papers to make me his legal property. Which explains why Pete was so confident this morning, Wakiza observed grimly. As far as the law is concerned, Blackthorne owns you like livestock. But Sarah wasn't finished. From deeper in her folder, she produced another document, this one clearly much older. Its edges yellow with age and bearing seals from the early days of territorial government. There's something else, she said. Something I discovered when I went through the oldest files in our office storage room looking for precedents. A partnership agreement from 1869, when Blackthorne first came to Dakota Territory. She spread the document on the hay bale beside the others, and Matilda felt her world shift again. Victor Blackthorne and Thomas Byrne were business partners for 2 years, jointly filing mineral claims throughout this region. They dissolved the partnership acrimoniously in 1871 with accusations of fraud and theft on both sides. The revelation stunned everyone present. Matilda stared at the faded signatures, her father's familiar script beside Blackthorne's elaborate flourish, and tried to reconcile this information with everything she thought she knew about her family's history. Your father never told you about the partnership? Sarah asked gently. Never. Matilda's mind raced through memories, searching for clues she might have missed. He always spoke of Blackthorne as an enemy, someone who couldn't be trusted. He never mentioned any business relationship. According to these documents, Thomas accused Blackthorne of falsifying assay reports and selling worthless claims to Eastern investors. Blackthorne counter-accused Thomas of sabotaging mining equipment and stealing ore samples to sell privately. Dr. Hale examined the partnership dissolution papers closely, his medical mind analyzing evidence like symptoms of disease. This explains so much. Blackthorne wasn't just eliminating a surveyor who threatened his water rights, he was settling an old score with a former partner who had exposed his fraudulent practices. It gets worse, Sarah continued. I found records of at least 6 Eastern investors who came to Dakota Territory between 1871 and 1878. All of them purchasing mining claims from Blackthorne based on falsified assay reports. Every single one of those men disappeared shortly after arriving to inspect their properties. The barn fell silent except for wind through the wooden walls. Outside, a crow cawed raucously, as if commenting on the darkness of human nature. "You're saying Blackthorne has been murdering investors for 7 years?" Beatrice asked. "I'm saying 6 men came to examine worthless mining claims, and 6 men vanished without trace. Their families back east received letters explaining they had decided to stay in the territory, but handwriting analysis would probably prove those letters were forged." The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut short further discussion. Through gaps in the barn walls, they could see riders spreading out to surround the building, Quiet Will, leading 6 armed men, their faces grim with deadly purpose. Matilda Byrne. Will's soft voice carried easily across the farmyard, somehow more menacing than any shout. "Come out now with your hands visible, and we'll discuss this like civilized people. Stay hidden, and things become unpleasant for everyone present." Adam moved toward his rifle, but Wakiza caught his arm with gentle firmness. "Too many of them, and they have legal authority to take her according to those forged papers." "Not if the papers can be proven forged," Dr. Hale said. "Try explaining legal technicalities while they're shooting at us," Beatrice replied tersely. Sarah Whitman stood up suddenly, her face set with resolution that reminded Matilda of her father in his most determined moments. "I'll go out there. As the clerk's wife, I have some authority in document disputes. Maybe I can buy you time to escape." "They'll kill you," Matilda said flatly. "The moment you challenge those papers, you become a threat they can't afford to leave alive." "Maybe. But I've been keeping quiet about Blackthorne's corruption for too long already." Sarah's voice carried the weight of accumulated guilt and newfound courage. "My husband takes his bribes and looks the other way, but I don't have to follow his example anymore." Before anyone could stop her, Sarah walked out of the barn with her hands raised, carrying the folder of forged documents like a shield against the armed men surrounding them. "Mr. Will." She called out, her voice carrying clearly across the farmyard. "Sarah Whitman here from the county clerk's office. I need to speak with you about these guardianship papers and some serious irregularities in their processing and legal foundation." What followed was several minutes of shouted accusations and legal arguments that grew increasingly heated as Will realized his carefully constructed scheme was being challenged by someone with actual authority. When Sarah refused to step aside and allow him to take Matilda without a proper hearing, Will's patience ran out entirely. The gunshots came without warning, 2 quick reports that dropped Sarah Whitman to the dusty ground like a broken doll, her folders scattering papers in the wind. Dr. Hale broke cover immediately, his medical training overriding personal safety, as he ran to help the wounded woman. He managed to drag her toward the barn before a rifle bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling in the dirt, with blood spreading across his shirt. "Doc," Adam shouted, breaking cover to help his friend reach safety. Will's next shot took Adam in the belly, folding him over like a closing knife. But the tough farmer kept moving, kept firing his rifle from his knees, face twisted with pain and grim determination. "To hell with this," he gasped between shots, his voice carrying across the farmyard. "No more debts to that snake. No more fear. Inside the barn, chaos reigned as bullets splintered wood and sent hay flying like yellow snow. Wakiza grabbed his rifle despite injured ribs, while Beatrice tried to create defensive positions among the hay bales. Matilda found herself holding Dr. Hale's pistol, wondering if she would have the courage to use it when the moment came. That moment arrived sooner than expected. Quiet Will and two men burst through the barn's side door, guns blazing and faces grim with lethal intent. Wakiza's rifle boomed, dropping one attacker instantly in a spray of blood and gunpowder. Beatrice swung a pitchfork with surprising strength, catching another in the shoulder and sending him screaming back outside. But Will kept coming, his pale eyes fixed on Matilda with single-minded intensity that spoke of obsession beyond mere duty. "Time to come home, Miss Byrne," he said softly, raising his pistol with practiced ease. "The boss is waiting, and he doesn't like to be kept waiting." Matilda raised Dr. Hale's gun with hands that shook despite her efforts to stay calm. At this range, she couldn't miss, but taking a human life, even Will's, was a line she had never imagined crossing. The moment stretched between them, like a taut wire broken by approaching hoofbeats from town's direction. Through the barn door, Matilda could see a column of blue uniforms, U.S. Army cavalry, riding hard with weapons drawn, and authority that superseded territorial law. "Federal marshals," someone shouted. "Drop your weapons immediately." Will's attention wavered for just an instant, but it was enough. Wakiza's rifle spoke again, and Blackthorn's foreman crumpled to the hay-strewn floor, his pale eyes staring at nothing as blood pooled beneath him. In the sudden silence that followed, Matilda realized the carefully constructed web of corruption that had controlled Dakota territory for years was finally beginning to unravel. But victory had come at a terrible price that would be remembered long after the legal proceedings concluded. Adam Pierce lay dying in the farmyard, his life bleeding into the dust he had worked so hard to make productive. Dr. Hale's shoulder wound was serious, but not fatal, though it would be weeks before he could practice medicine again. And Sarah Whitman clung to life by the thinnest thread, her testimony perhaps the only thing that could prove Blackthorn's documents were forged. As federal marshals secured the scene and began taking statements from survivors, Matilda looked down at the gun in her hands and wondered what her father would have thought of the woman his daughter had become. Thomas Byrne had taught her to survive, but she was learning that sometimes survival required choices no father could prepare his child to make. The war for Willow Creek was far from over, but the first major battle had been won. Now came the harder task of proving that justice could triumph over corruption, even when that corruption reached to the highest levels of territorial government. Chapter 6. Revelations. The federal marshals were led by Henry Cartwright, a stern-faced man in his 40s, whose badge bore U.S. District Court authority for Dakota Territory. While his men secured the scene and tended to wounded Cartwright, listened to their account with the careful attention of someone who had built his reputation separating truth from convenient fiction. "These are serious allegations," he said after examining Sarah Whitman's forged documents and Adam Pierce's blood-stained ledger page. "If proven true, they suggest conspiracy violating both territorial and federal law." Dr. Hale, his left arm in a makeshift sling fashioned from Beatrice's petticoat, struggled to sit upright despite obvious pain. "Marshal, those water samples in my bag contain evidence that Blackthorn's mine is deliberately poisoning Willow Creek in violation of federal water rights. Combined with the forged guardianship papers and bribery evidence, I understand the implications, Doctor." Cartwright's weathered face showed no emotion beyond professional interest. "The question is whether we can get you and your evidence to Crow's Landing alive." Quiet Will's death had eliminated Blackthorn's most dangerous enforcer, but it had also escalated the conflict beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Word of federal intervention would reach the mine owner within hours, and his response would be swift and merciless. "He'll try to destroy the evidence," Matilda predicted, thinking of her father's burned survey camp. "Mine records, the original survey stakes my father placed anything that could prove his guilt." Then we move fast. Cartwright turned to his sergeant. Send a rider to Crow's Landing immediately. Have them prepare for an emergency federal court hearing tomorrow morning. As marshals organized their escort, Wakiza approached Matilda, where she sat beside wounded Dr. Hale, pressing a wet cloth against Sarah Whitman's forehead. His movements were careful, favoring injured ribs, but his dark eyes held determination that reminded her of her father in stubborn moments. "There is something we must do before we leave for Crow's Landing," he said quietly. "What?" "Find your father's burned survey camp." Pete spoke truth about that, at least. If evidence remains, it could prove Blackthorn ordered the killing. The thought of seeing where her father died was almost too much to bear. But she knew Wakiza was right, and they needed every piece of evidence they could find if they hoped to break Blackthorn's hold on the territory. "Do you know where it was?" "I tracked him sometimes when he worked in the hills. White men were not always welcome in that country, but your father was different. He showed respect for sacred places." Wakiza's expression softened with memory. "He would share his coffee, ask about names we gave to places. He was trying to understand our ways." Marshal Cartwright overheard and turned from his preparations. "How long to reach this camp?" 3 hours' ride into the hills," Wakiza replied. "But the trail is narrow, difficult for large numbers. Take 2 men and go. We'll continue to Crow's Landing with the water samples and documents. If you find anything, bring it to the courthouse by sunset tomorrow." As the main party prepared to leave, Adam Pierce managed to pull himself up on one elbow, face gray, with pain and blood loss. The belly wound was beyond Dr. Hale's ability to treat in the field, and they all knew he was dying. "Tell my boy I paid the debt," he whispered to Wakiza, each word requiring enormous effort. "Tell him his pa wasn't a coward when it mattered most." Adam's death came 10 minutes later, almost a relief from suffering that had grown unbearable. He had lived long enough to see Quiet Will defeated and federal marshals take control, but the cost of his courage would be borne by the son he left behind. Sarah Whitman was alive, but unconscious, breathing shallow and labored. Dr. Hale did what he could with his one good arm, but her survival would depend on reaching proper medical care in Crow's Landing. "Go," he told Matilda as marshals prepared to carry Sarah to their wagon. "Find what your father died trying to protect. We'll hold the legal fort until you return." The ride into the hills above Willow Springs took Matilda, Wakiza, and 2 federal deputies along ancient game trails winding between stands of pine and aspen. The higher they climbed, the clearer the evidence of Thomas Burns' survey work became wooden stakes driven into ground at precise intervals, each marking corners of water rights boundaries that would have made Blackthorn's dam clearly illegal. "Your father was thorough," Wakiza observed, noting how stakes formed clear patterns across the landscape. These lines would have protected water rights for everyone downstream. They found the burned survey camp in a sheltered valley, where Willow Creek emerged from mountains as a clear, fast-running stream unmarked by mine pollution. The site had been chosen well close to water protected from wind, with good sight lines in all directions. But someone had made sure Thomas Burn never left this place alive. The remains of his tent and equipment lay scattered across the campsite, partially burned and weathered by nearly a year of exposure to Dakota Territory's harsh seasons. But Wakiza's practiced eye quickly found what they were looking for: signs of the struggle that had preceded the surveyor's death. Boot prints here where 2 men approached from different directions. He pointed out kneeling to examine faint impressions in hard earth. Scuff marks where someone was dragged. And there, he moved to a lightning-struck pine and carefully extracted something from a crack in the bark. It was a piece of cloth faded by weather, but still recognizably part of a mine guard's uniform and the same rough brown fabric Matilda had sewn countless times in her work as seamstress. One of the federal deputies found something even more damning. Partially buried under charred canvas was Thomas Burns' surveyor's transit, an expensive brass instrument no thief would have left behind. More importantly, The device still contained his field notes protected from fire by their metal case, coordinates and boundary descriptions for the entire creek watershed. The deputy read aloud from water-stained pages. Legal descriptions that would make any court challenge to water rights ironclad. But it was Matilda who made the most important discovery. While the men examined surveyor's equipment, she had been drawn to a pile of stones that seemed too regular to be natural. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in a shallow depression, was her father's journal. Thomas Burns' final entries told the story of his last days in heartbreaking detail. He had known he was being watched, had suspected his life was in danger, but had refused to abandon work that could protect hundreds of families downstream from Blackthorn's greed. But as Matilda read deeper, she discovered something that changed everything she thought she knew about her father's final mission. He hadn't just been surveying water rights, he had been investigating his former partner's illegal activities, gathering evidence of the fraud that had ended their business relationship years before. October 12, 1878. She read aloud, voice breaking with emotion. Found Victor's old claim markers from our partnership days. He's been filing false assay reports on abandoned sites, selling them to Eastern investors as active mines. The water rights survey was just an excuse. I've been documenting his swindling operation, collecting evidence that could send him to federal prison for decades. The final entry revealed the full scope of Thomas Burns' investigation and his growing awareness of mortal danger. October 17, 1878. They're coming up the valley now. 3 men, including Pete. I've hidden the evidence where Matilda will find it if she remembers what I taught her about reading the land. The transit contains more than survey notes. It holds proof of Victor's crimes going back 10 years. Tell her I'm proud of the woman she's becoming. Tell her the water must flow free, but more than that, tell her the truth must come to light, no matter the cost. By the time they rode back toward Crow's Landing, the sun was setting behind the mountains in shades of red and gold that reminded Matilda of blood and fire. But she carried with her proof that would expose Victor Blackthorn not just as a murderer, but as a systematic criminal whose fraudulent schemes had bilked investors out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The hardest part was over. Now came the challenge of staying alive long enough to see justice done and ensuring that her father's sacrifice would not be forgotten by history. Chapter 7. The Courthouse. The town of Crow's Landing squatted beside the Missouri River like scattered wooden boxes thrown by a careless child. Its main street a muddy track between hastily constructed buildings that spoke of frontier ambition overcoming aesthetic concerns. But it held the distinction of housing Dakota Territory's federal courthouse, a 2-story brick building representing United States government authority in a land where justice often came from gun barrels rather than legal precedents. Matilda arrived as church bells struck 8 in the evening, her clothes dusty from hard riding and heart heavy with her father's journal's weight. The federal courthouse blazed with lights. Despite the late hour, Marshal Cartwright had wasted no time convening an emergency hearing that could determine the territory's future. Inside, she found Dr. Hale arguing legal precedents with a territorial judge, while Beatrice organized documents on a long table with the methodical precision of someone who understood that details mattered more than dramatic gestures. Water samples were arranged in careful rows, each vial labeled and sealed, while forged guardianship papers lay spread beside them like evidence of elaborate crime. Matilda. Beatrice looked up as she entered, relief flooding her face. Thank heavens you're safe. How is Wakiza? Resting at the hotel with his ribs bound tight, but he'll live. Matilda set her father's journal on the table beside other evidence, noting how the worn leather cover seemed to command attention from everyone present. We found everything: his survey notes, his transit, and this. Judge Morrison, a silver-haired man in his 60s, appointed to the territorial bench by President Hayes himself, examined the journal with careful attention, someone who understood its implications. As he read Thomas Burns' final entries, his expression grew increasingly grim. This is direct evidence of premeditated murder. He pronounced his voice carrying the authority of federal law. Combined with the forged documents Mrs. Whitman identified and the water contamination Dr. Hale has documented, we have sufficient grounds for federal charges against Victor Blackthorne and his entire criminal organization. If we can serve the warrant, Marshal Cartwright interjected from where he stood studying maps of the territory. Blackthorne's not going to come quietly, and he's got 40 armed men at that mine who won't hesitate to fire on federal officers. Dr. Hale looked up from transcribing his water analysis findings, working despite his wounded shoulder, because he insisted on preparing testimony personally. There's something else we need to consider. If Blackthorne realizes he's facing federal charges, he might try to destroy evidence by opening the dam completely. What would that accomplish? Judge Morrison asked, though his legal mind was already working through possibilities. It would wash away every trace of mine contamination downstream, making it impossible to prove long-term environmental damage. It would also flood the Lakota camps and probably kill dozens of people. But Blackthorne's not known for humanitarian concerns. The implications sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with evening temperature. They were racing not just to establish Blackthorne's guilt, but to prevent a massacre that would be blamed on natural causes. How long would it take to organize a proper federal posse? Matilda asked. Marshal Cartwright consulted his pocket watch with the gesture of a man calculating odds. 6 hours to gather men and supplies. Another 4 to reach Rattler's End. Dawn at earliest, assuming we can move that quickly. Too long, she said flatly. By then the dam could be opened and evidence destroyed. More people will die while we follow legal procedures. What are you suggesting? Matilda looked around the room, at faces of people who had risked everything to expose Blackthorne's corruption. Dr. Hale, with his arm in a sling, still working despite pain that would have felled lesser men. Beatrice, who had lost her schoolhouse and nearly her life, standing up for justice. Wakiza, recovering upstairs from wounds, received protecting her. And somewhere in the territorial hospital, Sarah Whitman fighting for her life after being shot for trying to reveal the truth. Suggesting we end this tonight. She said, her father's voice echoing in memory, with lessons about taking action when words failed. Before anyone else dies for Victor Blackthorne's greed. The plan they developed was desperate, but simple in its audacity. While Marshal Cartwright organized his federal posse for a dawn assault on the mine, a smaller group would infiltrate Rattler's End under darkness. Their goal wasn't to capture Blackthorne impossible with only 4 people, but to secure the dam controls and prevent him from destroying evidence through mass murder. Wakiza insisted on joining despite his injuries. You will need someone who can move quietly in the dark, he argued. And I have debts to settle with Pete and his friends. Dr. Hale was in no condition to fight, but his knowledge of the mine's layout made him invaluable for planning their approach. Beatrice would remain at the courthouse to coordinate with federal authorities and ensure their evidence was preserved regardless of what happened at the mine. As they prepared to leave, Judge Morrison pulled Matilda aside for private conversation that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Miss Byrne, I want you to understand what you're risking tonight. If this mission fails, if Blackthorne captures you, the forged guardianship papers give him legal cover to do whatever he wants. You could disappear as completely as your father did. Matilda nodded, understanding the stakes with perfect clarity. I understand, Your Honor, but I also understand that some things are worth the risk. Your father would be proud of the woman you've become. I hope so, she replied, touching the gun at her hip. I'm about to find out if he taught me well enough to finish what he started. The ride back to Willow Springs took them through country that looked entirely different in darkness, where familiar landmarks became alien shapes, and navigation became a matter of following creek beds and game trails by instinct and memory. Twice they had to detour around patrols of armed men, mine guards searching for any sign of federal activity. They reached the hills above Rattler's End just after midnight, concealing their horses in aspen groves, before making their way on foot toward the mine complex that sprawled across the valley like a cancer. In the darkness below, they could see the collection of buildings that made up Blackthorn's empire, the main house mine offices, workers' barracks, and most importantly, the dam controlling Willow Creek's flow. Guard posts here and here, Dr. Hale whispered, pointing out positions he remembered from visits to treat injured miners. Dam controls are in a wooden shed beside the spillway. 2 men usually on duty, but they may have increased security after today's events. Through darkness, they could see lanterns moving around the mine compound as guards made rounds with military precision. But the shed beside the dam appeared unguarded. Either Blackthorn was overconfident, or it was a trap designed to lure them into killing ground. Only one way to find out, Matilda murmured, checking loads in her father's pistol. The descent toward the dam required all the woodcraft Thomas Byrne had taught his daughter during long afternoons in the wilderness. Moving from shadow to shadow, using rushing water's sound to mask footsteps, the small group made their way down the hillside toward their target. They were 50 yards from the dam when the trap was sprung. Lanterns flared to life around them as armed men stepped out from concealment behind rocks and trees, creating a ring of light and rifle barrels. In the sudden glare, Matilda could see Greasy Pete's scarred face grinning at them from beside the dam controls. "Well, well," Pete called out, his voice carrying triumph and anticipation. "Look what wandered into our web." The little seamstress and her tame savage come to save the day like heroes in a dime novel. Behind Pete, Victor Blackthorn emerged from shadows, like some pale demon conjured from his own mind's depths. The man was tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that held all the warmth of winter moonlight on fresh snow. But it was his smile that made Matilda's blood run cold, the expression of someone who had won a game she didn't even know she was playing. "Miss Byrne," Blackthorn said, in a voice that carried easily across the water, cultured and soft. "How good of you to come home at last. We have so much to discuss about your father's unfortunate end and your own bright future." But as they stood trapped in the lantern's glare with guns pointed at them from every direction, Matilda remembered something her father had written in his journal, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on crucial importance. Thomas Byrne hadn't just been investigating Blackthorn's fraudulent mining claims. He had discovered that the mine owner was using the dam not just to wash ore, but to hide evidence of his criminal activities. The reservoir behind the dam contained not just diverted water, but the remains of swindled investors who had come west to inspect their worthless claims, never returned home. "You know, Victor," Matilda called out, her voice carrying clearly across the water. "My father left more than just survey notes in his journal. He documented everything, including the real reason you built that dam." Blackthorn's confident expression flickered slightly like candlelight in wind. "Your father was a thorough man, I'll grant you that. But dead men tell no tales, Miss Byrne, don't they?" Matilda pulled the journal from her coat, holding it up where he could see it. "He wrote about the Eastern investors who came looking for their mining claims, the ones who disappeared after meeting with you. The ones whose bodies you dumped in the creek bed before flooding it with your dam." The revelation sent a ripple of uncertainty through Blackthorn's men. Several guards exchanged nervous glances, realizing they might have been working for a mass murderer whose crimes reached far beyond simple fraud. "It's Coker. That's a fascinating theory," Blackthorn said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Unfortunately, you won't live long enough to share it with anyone who matters." It was then that Sarah Whitman appeared from the darkness beyond the ring of light, moving slowly but determinedly, despite her injuries and the pain that must have been excruciating. She had somehow escaped from the federal escorts taking her to Crow's Landing, driven by knowledge that her testimony was crucial to stopping Blackthorn's final crime. "Actually," she said, her voice weak but clear, "she already has shared it with someone who matters. I've been keeping records of everything, not just the forged guardianship papers, but financial transactions, mysterious disappearances, and insurance claims filed on behalf of missing investors. From her bag, she produced a thick ledger that even in the lantern light was clearly filled with years of meticulous documentation. 15 years of evidence, Victor. Every crime, every fraud, every murder you thought was safely buried under tons of water and legal paperwork. The sight of Sarah's ledger caused several of Blackthorn's men to lower their weapons slightly, uncertainty replacing blind loyalty. The mine owner realized his carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him, and his response was both swift and desperate. "Kill them all," he shouted, his cultured voice cracking with panic. "Burn the ledger, open the damn gates." What followed was the most chaotic and terrifying battle Matilda had ever experienced. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as some of Blackthorn's men turned against their employer while others remained loyal. In the confusion, Pete began frantically working the heavy levers controlling the spillway gates. Wakiza, despite his injuries, moved with warrior's grace through the melee. His rifle found Pete just as the mine guard succeeded in opening the first gate. Water began pouring through in increasing volume, but the warrior's shot spun Pete away from the controls before he could open the remaining gates. Dr. Hale, fighting despite his wounded arm, managed to reach Sarah Whitman and pull her to safety behind a pile of ore carts. Beatrice, who had secretly followed them from Crow's Landing, appeared with several federal marshals who had been positioned in the hills as backup. The battle reached its climax when Blackthorn himself, seeing his empire crumbling and his crimes exposed, made a desperate attempt to complete the dam's destruction. He fought his way to the spillway controls, determined to wash away all evidence of his crimes, even if it meant drowning hundreds of innocent people downstream. Matilda found herself facing the man who had killed her father and destroyed so many lives. As Blackthorn's hand reached for the final lever that would release the full fury of the dammed creek, she made a choice that would define the rest of her life. Using every skill her father had taught her about reading terrain and understanding water flow, she realized there was another way to stop the flood. A manual release valve, hidden beneath the dam's walkway, could drain the reservoir gradually, instead of all at once, a safety mechanism Thomas Byrne had noted in his journal. But Blackthorn had apparently forgotten. While Wakiza and the marshals engaged Blackthorn's remaining men in fierce combat, Matilda crawled beneath the wooden walkway and found the valve her father had described. As she worked to open it, with hands that shook from adrenaline and fear, Blackthorn spotted her and raised his rifle for a killing shot. But Sarah Whitman, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, threw herself between Matilda and the mine owner's weapon. The shot that would have killed Thomas Byrne's daughter instead sent the brave clerk's wife sprawling across the dam's planking, but her sacrifice bought precious seconds. Wakiza's final shot dropped Blackthorn into the spillway, where the rushing water swept him away into the darkness below. With the immediate threat eliminated and the reservoir draining safely through the manual valve, the battle for Willow Creek came to its bloody end. The corruption that had poisoned Dakota territory for years was finally exposed, and the water that gave life to the entire valley would flow free once more. But victory had come at a terrible cost that would be remembered long after the legal proceedings concluded and the politicians moved on to other concerns. Epilogue. Justice flows. The trials that followed the Battle of Rattler's End, as newspapers came to call it, lasted through the autumn of 1879 and into the following spring. Federal prosecutors had more than enough evidence to convict the surviving members of Blackthorn's criminal organization, thanks to Sarah Whitman's meticulous record-keeping and Thomas Byrne's detailed documentation of the fraud schemes. Sheriff Merrick was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for conspiracy and bribery. County Clerk Phillips received 15 years for document forgery and fraud. Judge Harrison was removed from the bench and faced federal charges that would keep him imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. But the most significant outcome of the trials was the comprehensive reform of water rights law throughout Dakota Territory. Thomas Burns' survey work became the legal foundation for fair water distribution, ensuring that no single individual or corporation could monopolize the precious resource that meant survival on the frontier. The reservoir behind Blackthorn's Dam was slowly drained and excavated under federal supervision. As Sarah Whitman had suspected, they found the remains of 6 Eastern investors whose disappearances had been carefully orchestrated. Each man received proper burial, and their families back east finally learned the truth about their loved ones' fates. Matilda inherited her father's homestead claim, 160 acres of prime land near Prairie Rose, with water rights that were now legally secure under federal protection. But instead of simply farming the land as most women in her situation would have done, she had grander plans inspired by everything she had learned about cooperation and community during their struggle against corruption. Within months of the trial's conclusion, she had converted the homestead buildings into a cooperative workshop where Lakota women, white widows, and poor farmers' wives could earn fair wages producing goods for the territory's growing population. The enterprise was both practical and profitable, fitting perfectly with 19th century expectations for women's work, while providing genuine economic independence for families that had been marginalized by Blackthorn's system. The workshop produced everything from clothing and household goods to handcrafted furniture and leather goods. All employment agreements were posted publicly at Beatrice's rebuilt schoolhouse, ensuring complete transparency in every transaction. The cooperative's reputation for quality work and honest dealing spread rapidly, attracting orders from distant cities and establishing a model that other communities began to emulate throughout the frontier. Wakiza returned to his people with the assurance that water would flow freely for all who needed it. But he maintained close ties with the cooperative and served as an informal mediator when disputes arose between different communities. His relationship with Matilda was based on mutual respect, forged through shared dangers rather than romantic fantasy, a practical alliance that honored both their cultures while building bridges between peoples who had been kept apart by artificial barriers. Dr. Hale established a proper medical practice in Crow's Landing, funded by compensation awarded to him for his injuries and his crucial role in exposing the conspiracy. He continued to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay, but now had resources to provide quality health care throughout the territory. His water contamination research became the foundation for environmental protection laws that would serve as models for other territories seeking statehood. Beatrice rebuilt her schoolhouse with federal assistance, creating an institution that served as both educational center and community meeting place. Children of all backgrounds learned together in classrooms where cooperation was valued more than competition, where different languages and cultures were seen as resources rather than problems. Sarah Whitman had survived her injuries, but would carry the scars for the rest of her life. She had chosen to remain in Crow's Landing, working with federal authorities to establish new standards for legal documentation that would prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had flourished under her husband's administration. Her ledgers became the basis for financial oversight that would protect future generations from similar schemes. On a warm evening in late October, exactly 1 year after Thomas Burns' murder, Matilda stood beside Willow Creek as it flowed through her father's carefully surveyed land. The sound of children playing drifted from Beatrice's school while smoke from cooking fires rose peacefully from the re-established Lakota camps along the creek banks. The water ran clear and clean, no longer poisoned by mine runoff or controlled by a single man's greed. Fish had returned to pools that had been barren for years. Crops flourished in fields that had been withering from artificial drought. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, as if some great weight had been lifted from its shoulders. As full darkness settled over the valley, Matilda walked to a small rise overlooking the creek, where a simple wooden cross marked her father's final resting place. His body had been recovered from that lonely survey camp and brought home to rest in soil he had mapped with such care and precision. "We finished it, Papa," she whispered, placing fresh wildflowers on the grave. The water flows free, the corruption has been exposed, and your work will protect people for generations to come. I hope I made you proud." A gentle breeze stirred the grass around the grave marker, carrying the scent of clean water and the promise of rain to nourish growing things. In that moment, Matilda finally understood that some things were indeed worth any price required to protect them, and that her father's faith in her had been justified by the woman she had become through trial and struggle. Standing beside the creek that had cost so much to preserve, surrounded by sounds of a community rebuilding itself on principles of justice and cooperation, she knew with absolute certainty that Thomas Burns' legacy would endure as long as water flowed through the valley he had died to protect. The long fight was finally over, and justice had prevailed. But more than that, the seeds of something better had been planted in Dakota Territory soil, seeds that would grow into a society where power served people, rather than the other way around, where the water's edge belonged to everyone who needed it to survive and thrive. The frontier was changing, and Matilda Byrne had played her part in shaping that change for the better. As she walked back toward her home through darkness lit by stars, she could hear her father's voice one last time, carried on the wind that rose from Willow Creek. "The land doesn't lie, Maddie, and neither should the people who claim to serve it." In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, but the sound no longer carried menace. It was simply part of the natural world reclaiming its place in a valley where justice and water flowed free once more.